The suitcase was already on the porch when Maeve got home. Not packed by her own hands, not discussed, just there, sitting in the November cold like it had always belonged outside, like she was the one who didn't fit inside anymore. She stood at the end of the driveway for a long moment, keys still in her hand, the engine of her car ticking as it cooled. She told herself she was reading the situation wrong, that there was an explanation. Maybe Clifton had pulled it out because they were supposed to travel somewhere and she had forgotten, the way she sometimes forgot things these days. Appointments, grocery lists, the names of people at his work events she'd shaken hands with a dozen times. But then she saw the envelope. Cream-colored, the kind used for formal correspondence, propped against the handle of the suitcase. Her full name written on the front in Clifton's handwriting, Maeve Holloway, as if she were a stranger receiving certified mail rather than his wife of 9 years. She didn't open it standing there in the driveway. She walked up the porch steps. She tried the front door. Locked. She knocked. Her own front door, the one she'd repainted herself 2 summers ago, the one she'd chosen the color for, a warm slate blue that Clifton had said looked fine, and no one answered for a long time. Then the door opened, and it wasn't Clifton. It was a woman Maeve had met exactly 4 times. Her name was Sylvia, and she worked in Clifton's firm, and she was standing in Maeve's kitchen doorway wearing what looked like Clifton's Oxford shirt and nothing else. Maeve didn't scream. She didn't cry. Something in her went very quiet and very cold, the way a house goes quiet after a power outage, that sudden absence of all the background noise you didn't even know was there. Clifton appeared behind Sylvia a moment later. He looked at Maeve on the porch, and then he looked at the floor. "I had Donna draw up the papers," he said. "They're in the envelope." Donna was their attorney. The one they'd used together when they bought the house. When they'd done estate planning 2 years ago, sitting across a conference table holding hands, because Clifton had said it felt morbid, and Maeve had squeezed his fingers and said it's just paperwork. "We're fine." "I didn't want it to be a whole thing," Clifton said. "You can take the Volvo." Maeve looked at him for a long time. She thought about 9 years. She thought about the way he used to call her Maevie in the first 2 years, before he stopped. She thought about how she'd noticed the distance growing between them and had told herself it was normal, that long marriages had seasons, that this was just winter and spring would come. She picked up her suitcase. She walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting it, the envelope in her lap, and she noticed something. She wasn't crying. She thought she would be crying. But instead, she felt a strange, clear-eyed calm, the kind that she would later understand was the feeling of something ending so completely that grief hadn't even caught up with it yet. What she didn't tell Clifton, what she had only found out that morning from her doctor, in the last place she'd expected to receive life-altering news, sitting in a paper gown on an exam table while Dr. Harding's nurse had paged the doctor back into the room with an expression Maeve couldn't read, was that she was pregnant, 7 weeks, twins. She drove to the nearest coffee shop, ordered a tea she didn't drink, and sat in the corner booth until it got dark outside. She spent the first 3 nights at her college roommate's apartment on the other side of the city. By the 4th day, she'd found a furnished studio sublet near the hospital district, month to month, which was all she could afford on her school counselor salary, while Clifton's lawyers moved at what seemed like a deliberate, grinding pace through the divorce proceedings. The pregnancy was its own quiet crisis she carried alongside everything else, like a second bag she hadn't agreed to carry. She didn't tell anyone, not her roommate, not her sister in Austin, not her mother, who would cry in a way that would require Maeve to comfort her, and Maeve had no room for that yet. She went to her prenatal appointments alone. She sat in waiting rooms full of couples looking at their phones together, and she looked at her own phone, scrolling through nothing. At her 12-week appointment, she was sitting in the waiting room when a man dropped his keys at her feet. She bent to pick them up at the same moment he did, and they nearly knocked foreheads. "I'm so sorry," he said. He had kind eyes, the specific kind of kind that looks earned rather than performed. "No harm done," Maeve said and handed them back. He sat 2 chairs away. He was there alone too, she noticed. He had a file folder open on his lap and kept reading the same page, and she could tell he wasn't absorbing any of it. When the nurse called her name, She stood, and he looked up briefly. Their eyes met, and he gave her the small nod that strangers give each other in waiting rooms, when they've been sitting near each other long enough to feel like temporary acquaintances. She thought nothing more of it, but at the front desk on her way out, the receptionist told her that her insurance claim from last month had been flagged, and she'd need to call the billing department. Maeve stood at the counter trying to sort it out and couldn't because the policy was still under Clifton's employer plan, and Clifton's HR department wasn't returning her calls. And she felt the first prickle of real panic, not about the pregnancy, not about the apartment, but about the sheer administrative avalanche of disentangling herself from someone she'd been legally attached to for 9 years. She stepped away from the counter and sat back down in the waiting room because she needed 60 seconds to not be in front of another person who needed something from her. The man with the keys was still there. He glanced at her. "Insurance?" he said. She looked at him. "You have the look," he said. "I had the look for about 3 months straight last year," she laughed, which surprised her. "That obvious? I'm a doctor. I diagnose things. Is insurance face in the DMM? It should be." He closed his file folder. "Do you want me to try? I have a system." She stared at him. "You don't have to do that?" "I know," he said. "But I'm waiting for my father's follow-up, and it's been 45 minutes, and I've read this same page about 14 times. He nodded at the file. "So honestly, you'd be doing me a favor." His name, she learned, was Reed. No, wait, she learned that later. In the waiting room, she only learned that he was an orthopedic surgeon at the hospital connected to this practice, that he had been dealing with his own father's insurance nightmare for the better part of a year, and that he had, through what he described as pure spite and persistence, developed a working knowledge of billing appeal processes that was frankly alarming for someone whose actual job was reattaching tendons. He spent 22 minutes on her phone with the billing department. When he handed it back to her, the claim was flagged for internal review, and she had a reference number. "How did you do that?" she said. "I asked to speak to a supervisor, and then I didn't get off the phone," he said. "That's the whole system." She laughed again. It felt unfamiliar in her chest, like a muscle she hadn't used. His father's appointment finished. An older man came out of the back, tall, silver-haired, with the measured gait of someone who had recently been told to slow down and was choosing not to. He introduced himself as Harold, and he shook Maeve's hand with the kind of warm formality that belonged to another generation, the kind that felt like being welcomed rather than merely greeted. "My son has been keeping you company?" Harold said. "He fixed my insurance problem," Maeve said. Harold looked pleased. He was always the practical one. She walked out to the parking lot. The surgeon, whose first name turned out to be Hugh, walked out with his father, and their paths went the same direction for half a block, and then diverged. And that should have been the end of it. Except that 2 days later, she was in the hospital cafeteria eating a salad she didn't want because the pregnancy had made her food aversion severe, and a salad was the one thing she could get down. And he sat down across from her. "You come here often?" he said. "I had a follow-up," she said. "Me too." He had a coffee and a file folder again. Always a file folder. "How'd the billing resolve?" "Still pending, but I have a reference number." "That's 90% of the battle." He looked at her for a moment. "I don't usually sit down uninvited, but you looked like you were having a bad day." "I'm having a bad several months," she said honestly, because she was too tired to pretend. He nodded. He didn't ask what kind of bad. He just said, "Do you want company, or would you rather I leave you to the salad?" She thought about it. Company, she said. "As long as you don't ask questions, I can do that." They ate in the quiet cafeteria and didn't talk about anything heavy. He told her that the hospital had recently installed a new coffee machine that everyone had strong feelings about. She told him she was a school counselor. He said that was a harder job than surgery, actually, because at least in surgery you could close. She laughed, and it felt a little less unfamiliar this time. She ran into him 4 more times over the following 6 weeks, in the way you run into people when your life has contracted to a small geography. The hospital, the pharmacy nearby, the coffee shop on Glenmore that seemed to be everyone's coffee shop. The 4th time, he asked if she wanted to have dinner sometime, and she said she needed to tell him something first. She told him about the divorce. She told him about the pregnancy. He was quiet for a moment, said, "Are you okay?" Not that's complicated or "oh wow," or the sideways look she'd braced for. Just, "Are you okay?" she said she was managing. He said, "The dinner offer stands if you want it, no agenda." Just dinner. They had dinner. They had dinner again. By the third dinner, she had started to notice things about him. The way he listened, actually listened, not waiting for a pause to speak, but tracking what she was saying and asking questions that showed he'd been paying attention. The way he was with Harold, patient and unhurried even when Harold was being stubborn about his physical therapy. The way he never made her feel like the situation she was in was something to be navigated carefully around. He never made her feel like a complication. By the time her twins were born, 2 boys, 8 pounds combined, named in the delivery room under a set of circumstances that felt both chaotic and holy. Hugh was in the waiting room, not because she'd asked him, because he'd asked her if she wanted someone there, and she'd said she didn't want to impose, and he'd said, "That's not what I asked." Harold was in the waiting room too. He'd brought a thermos of good coffee and a crossword puzzle, and when the nurse came out to say that Maeve and the boys were stable and doing well, he stood up and pressed his hand briefly over his heart and didn't say anything, because some things don't need saying. Maeve found out about the gala from Petra. Petra had been Maeve's closest friend during the years of her marriage. A holdover friendship she'd managed to keep because Petra had never particularly liked Clifton and had never pretended otherwise, which meant the friendship required no renegotiating when the marriage ended. Petra still moved in overlapping social circles with Clifton's crowd through her work in commercial real estate, and she heard things. "He's hosting a fundraiser gala," Petra said, "the Barrett Foundation event. He's chairing it this year." "Good for him," Maeve said. "He invited you," Petra said. "He personally made sure your name was on the list." Maeve set down her coffee. "His new girlfriend is going to be there," Petra continued. "I heard him at a dinner last month saying he wanted Maeve to see how things have moved on. He actually said that. I want her to see." There it was. Not the invitation itself, but the intention behind it. The gala was the same as the cream-colored envelope had been, a formality that was really a statement. Maeve sat with it for a week. She thought about not going. She thought about going and saying nothing to anyone and simply attending and leaving early. She thought about 100 different versions of that evening, and in all of them, she was the same person she'd been standing at the end of her driveway, with a suitcase in her hand, bracing herself. Then Harold called. This was not unusual. Harold called regularly to check in on the boys. He called them the boys from the very first week, with the easy propriety of someone who has simply decided how something is going to be, and to talk about what he'd read in the newspaper, and sometimes just to talk, which Maeve had come to understand was something Harold needed more than he would ever say out loud. This time, Harold called because he'd heard about the gala. "I want to take you," he said, "as my guest, Harold. I knew Clifton's father," Harold said, 20 years ago, before Gerald Barrett passed. "Gerald and I were in the same golf club, and we both knew we were terrible at golf, and we both knew neither of us was going to admit it." He paused. "I have some standing in that room. I want to use it." Maeve said, "You don't have to fight my battles, ass." "No," Harold said, "but I'd like to attend an event with the woman who is making my son happy for the first time in years, and I would like her to feel the way she deserves to feel in that room. That's not fighting your battles. That's just accompanying someone to a party." She said she would think about it. She thought about it for one day and then called him back and said yes. Hugh drove them. The 3 of them in his car, Harold in the front because of his hip, Maeve in the back. She was wearing a dress she'd bought 2 weeks ago, emerald green, the kind of dress she'd stopped buying somewhere in the middle of her marriage when she'd gradually, without noticing, started dressing like someone who was trying not to take up space. She noticed Hugh watching her in the rearview mirror as he drove. Not the way men look at women when they're cataloging, the way someone looks when they want to make sure you're all right. "You look beautiful," he said, not elaborated upon, just said like a fact. She looked out the window. She was going to cry, and she would not cry in the car, so she looked at the streetlights instead. Harold had a car service pick him up separately. He'd insisted. He'd said it was because of parking logistics, but Maeve understood it differently. Harold had a particular sense of theater, and he'd decided how he wanted this to go. The Barrett Foundation Gala was held at the Holloway Grand, which Maeve had always found quietly funny as a piece of nominal coincidence, and tonight found genuinely funny for the first time, because she was walking into a building with her own name on it as the guest of Harold Ackerman, who had been one of the founding donors of this very foundation 30 years ago, a fact she had not known until 3 days ago when she'd looked Harold up and felt her eyes go wide. She had asked Hugh about it, and he'd said, with characteristic mildness, "Did I not mention that?" "You did not," she'd said. "Dad doesn't like to make a thing of it." Harold was waiting at the entrance. He'd changed into a dark suit that suggested he had opinions about tailoring. He offered Maeve his arm, and she took it, and they walked into the gala together, and she felt the shift in the room the moment people registered who Harold Ackerman was walking in with. She did not look for Clifton, she let the room come to her. She was introduced to 6 people in the first 10 minutes. A former senator who remembered Harold from a different era. 2 women from the foundation board, who clearly adored Harold in the practiced way of people who have worked alongside someone for a long time and understand exactly what they're dealing with. A man who was apparently the current president of a hospital network, who shook Hugh's hand and said, "Ackerman, I heard you turned down the department chair offer, you idiot," in a tone that was entirely affectionate. Hugh had turned down a department chair offer. He hadn't told her that either. They had champagne, sparkling water for Maeve, who was still nursing, a fact she had not broadcast, but that Hugh had simply quietly remembered and mentioned to the server without making a production of it. She was standing with Harold and a woman named Vera, something when she heard the pause, the specific quality of silence that moves through a room when someone registers a surprise. She didn't turn around. She waited, and then she heard Clifton's voice from somewhere behind her and to the left, saying her name, Maeve. She turned around. He looked the way he always had, well-dressed, careful, the kind of handsome that photographs well but doesn't warm a room. Standing beside him was Sylvia, who was wearing a red dress, and who met Maeve's eyes with an expression that had apparently traveled quite a distance from the confidence of the morning in the kitchen doorway, because now she just looked like someone who wanted to leave. "Clifton," Maeve said. "I didn't know you'd be. I mean, how did you?" He was looking at Harold, registering the arm, registering the room's reception of them. "Harold invited me," Maeve said. "Do you know Harold Ackerman?" Clifton knew who Harold Ackerman was. Everyone in this room knew who Harold Ackerman was. The Barrett Foundation had been co-founded by Harold Ackerman. Clifton had been trying to get a meeting with Harold Ackerman's family office for 18 months through his firm. She had learned this from Petra only yesterday, and had not been able to secure one. Harold shook Clifton's hand with the pleasant, courteous disinterest of a man who has met thousands of Cliftons and remembers none of them. "Lovely event," Harold said. Gerald would have been pleased. He steered Maeve gently toward the other side of the room, and that was that. Hugh appeared at her elbow. He handed her a sparkling water and said nothing, just stood beside her, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not grand gestures, just someone who shows up and stays. She heard the rest of it from Petra, who had eyes on the room all evening. Sylvia, it turned out, had been conducting a parallel situation of her own. Clifton had apparently believed otherwise. The confrontation happened near the coat check, quietly, in the way confrontations at formal events go, whispered and rapid and terrible. Clifton had left the gala early. Sylvia had left separately. Maeve was in the car on the way home, her heels off, her feet tucked under her, Harold half asleep in the front seat, when Petra texted her. He left alone. She put her phone away. Outside the window, the city passed in long yellow streaks of light. Hugh glanced at her in the mirror. "How are you doing back there?" he said. "Good," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her, and then didn't. She and Hugh got married the following spring. The ceremony was small. Her sister from Austin, a handful of friends, Petra as maid of honor, Harold in the front row with the twins in the double stroller he'd insisted on buying, the expensive kind with the suspension system, because Harold had opinions about suspension systems. The boys were 8 months old, and largely unimpressed by the proceedings. except when Harold made faces at them, which they found extremely funny. It wasn't the wedding Maeve had imagined when she was young, which was probably fine, because the things she had imagined when she was young had belonged to a version of herself who hadn't learned yet what she actually needed. What she needed turned out to be simpler and harder than she'd understood. Someone who listened, someone who stayed, someone who knew about the referral number and remembered she wasn't drinking champagne and drove when Harold's hip was bad and never once made her feel like a burden for having arrived in his life already carrying so much. Harold's toast was short. He talked about Gerald Barrett and about the strange ways lives become connected across time, and about how he'd once told Hugh that the best things in life tend to arrive in the form of an inconvenience you decide to lean into. He looked at Maeve when he said it. She didn't cry during the toast. She had cried earlier privately getting ready, happy crying, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. She saw Clifton once more about a year later. It was incidental, a charity auction that Hugh's hospital sponsored, the kind of event neither of them would have sought out, but both had been dragged to by separate obligations. Clifton was across the room, and for a moment you clock an old landmark from a car window. There it is, and then it's gone. He looked fine. Older, maybe. Or just more tired. She hoped he was doing okay, and she found, checking herself honestly, that she actually meant it. Not generously or magnanimously. Just, she didn't wish him ill. She'd stopped wishing him anything, which was its own kind of peace. Hugh was beside her. He noticed where she was looking, followed it, and understood without her having to say anything. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah," she said. "I really am." They got drinks. They found people to talk to. At some point in the evening, Harold called Hugh's cell to report that the boys had refused to go to sleep and had somehow convinced the babysitter to let them watch an extra episode of something they weren't supposed to watch. And Harold was calling to see if this was a negotiable house rule or a firm one. Hugh covered the phone and looked at Maeve. "Firm," she said, "definitely firm." Hugh said this to Harold. Harold said something back that made Hugh laugh. The room was warm and lit and full of people, and Maeve Holloway stood in the middle of it and felt, without drama, without ceremony, the specific and unhurried arrival of a life that actually belonged to her.